Okay. Thank you for coming today. Before I get started, I need to know, can everybody hear me? Is the audio actually working today? Because the audio did not work last time I tried this, and it worked when I tested it, and it worked when I tested it last night, so it worked when I tested it today. So let me know if the audio's not working. Okay, I'm hearing it back through my preview, but doesn't mean it's going. So, okay, great. Thank you, Chris. There's audio. So, let me pull up my notes. Just so you guys know, I will take... Oh, great. Excellent. Audio's working. We'll see if the rest of this works now. Just so you know, I'm going to have a hard time following along in the chat while I'm doing this, but I will take questions towards the end, maybe in places in between. So if you've got questions, you can put them in the chat. I'll try and scroll back through and do them later if I can answer them. But thank you again. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Dave Stagl. If you don't know who I am, it says that on the... There it is. It says that down there. I'm an audio engineer based in Atlanta, mix engineer, front of house engineer, producer. I got started in audio about 30 years ago back in high school, and I've been a full-time professional for over 20 years now. Most of the work I do is with houses of worship, and that's behind a console, and I do a lot of training and development for churches. And before this whole COVID-19 thing happened, I was actually traveling regularly and helping churches improve their audio on site and training teams and engineers to get better. So before I was doing that, I was on church staff for a while, and you can read bios and stuff. They're floating around, I guess, if you want to find more info on me. But a big part of what I've been doing for a long time is helping teach people how to get better at mixing. So today, that's what we're going to do. So let me find my slides. Oh, there we go. Slides. Okay, so first and foremost, we're talking about mixing, and there's a big misconception when it comes to mixing. A lot of people think it's a technical thing, but mixing is not a technical discipline. We can't just take a checklist or a chart and have people go down a list and there's a great mix. The top-level mixers often will talk about things like emotion and impact, and those are not technical things. Mixing is a craft. To me, mixing music especially is a musical discipline. It takes time and it takes practice to master. Once upon a time, you go into churches, maybe not so much anymore since everybody's on digital consoles these days, it seems. But, people, they used to have like the China marker kind of on the faders, like set everything to here, and that's the mix. And then they would ask, why doesn't it sound good, or why doesn't it sound right? And it's because you can't go by technical things. It's a craft. It takes time to do it. So, let's do this. All right, so the whole 10,000 hours thing has probably been debunked, but I think there's some truth to it. So let's look at this. And by the way, today, since a lot of what I do is with houses of worship, I'm probably going to gear a lot of this towards houses of worship, but if you're just trying to get better at audio engineering, if you're trying to help your team get better at it, a lot of these concepts are applicable to any kind of engineering. The context of where I spend most of my time these days is houses of worship, so that's what some of this content is going to be. So 10,000 hours. There is some truth to it, I think. And so let's just think in terms of a typical church engineer who's probably a volunteer. Let's say maybe he's going to serve 2 hours at a rehearsal in the middle of the week, and then maybe 4 hours on a Sunday. And that's a total of 6 hours in a week. And maybe they do that twice a month. Well, how long is it going to take them to get to 10,000 hours, only putting that much time in. It's almost a lifetime for a lot of people even. So let's aim lower. Let's just say 2,000 hours. Well, 2,000 hours, that's close to 14 years. And most people's expectations for audio these days are pretty high. I think it's the most critiqued element of production in a church and even in a lot of different environments, especially live environments. It's all about the sound. Nowadays, while everybody has really got an emphasis on streaming, the audio quality is a big thing I see talked about, and people are having a hard time doing that. So how do we close that window of time it's going to take for us to master things as much as possible so that we can really maximize development? And for me, I think it's important to have kind of a systematic approach of sorts to do it. So, when a musician is learning to play an instrument, they don't just pick up the instrument and jump into really complicated songs. They start with basics. I mean, when I was taking piano lessons in the 6th grade, it was really simple songs, and we were learning things like scales and simple stuff. And you would build over time as your skills would improve. And with audio, we kind of want to do the same thing to a certain extent. So today what I want to roll out for you is kind of my roadmap for audio development. This isn't necessarily a step-by-step guide, though. This is more, what are the things that you want to focus on the most in any given time? I think you have to kind of jump into a lot of these aspects all at once if you're going to be behind a console. And in a lot of churches, maybe there's 1 or 2 guys who are doing everything. So it's going to take time. You can't just only focus on one of these in a lot of those cases. But what this is to me is these are the things you should master, that you should focus on mastering first in order to improve and to make the biggest gains. So ground zero, where do we start? Whoops, back to slides. Where do we start? Where do you start with somebody who's brand new? Maybe your friend wants to learn audio, wants to get started. You have a new volunteer who's come on. They know nothing about audio. And for me, where I would start is I start with the tools, because you can't build a house if you don't know what a hammer is to begin with. I've had volunteers come on and join my team in the past who didn't know what the different parts of a drum kit were. And that's fine. That's perfectly acceptable. Everybody starts from nowhere. So it's okay to start from nowhere. It's okay to start with no knowledge. So the first thing I want people to know, though, is what are the tools that we're going to use? Next one. All right, so when I talk about tools, I'm really talking about gear. But what are the tools that you have? It's real easy for audio geeks, especially like me, to just talk about a lot of different tools that are out there, but I think it's important that you start with the tools that you actually have. What are the tools that your volunteer or your new crew member will actually be able to use? I don't need to teach somebody something that they're not going to have access to. So what are the tools you have? Where are those tools? A big thing for me when I go into churches to train or to mix, a lot of times I'm asking, where do I find certain things, especially if I'm going to mix? I want to know what's the location. Sometimes where things are stored is really organized and kind of intuitive. Sometimes it's not so much. Sometimes I'm just looking for an actual tool, like a screwdriver, and that is really hard to find, surprising to me, backstage in a lot of churches. So where are things kept? Setup and tear down procedures. How do you get set up for a service? How do you get set up for a session? How do you tear things down? So wrapping cables, storing mic stands, storing gear, things like that. Any documentation that you're going to use. Do you use service orders, track sheets, what input lists? What kind of documentation are people going to be looking at? Processes and procedures, again, kind of goes with setup and teardown, but with this it could be, what does your flow look like going to Sunday? What does rehearsal look like? What does rehearsal and services on a Sunday morning look like? What's the whole kind of flow for the audio situation you're in? Terminology, it's another thing. You know, if I say, go mic that kick to somebody, do they know what a kick drum is? Do they know when I say kick that I mean a kick drum? Not necessarily. Do they know that mic is short for microphone? Things like that. These are terminology things that when we've been doing this a long time, we take a lot of that for granted. But someone who's brand new, they're not going to know that kind of stuff necessarily. They might, but you want to make sure that everybody understands the terminology. We want to know that everybody knows the vocabulary we're going to use to communicate. Another thing in here, basic signal flow. Signal flow is really key, I think, to understand, especially these days with digital consoles. Digital consoles, there's so much we can do internally with signal flow that it can be a confusing kind of thing, especially for somebody who doesn't understand it just in the basics beforehand. And that can be as simple as, you know, how do we patch in a microphone for a guitar or a snare drum or a keyboard, or pick your favorite instrument. So some tips in here. Again, stay practical. Stick with the stuff that people are actually going to use. Like I said, you don't need to teach people the entire Sweetwater or B&H catalog when they're brand new. I wouldn't necessarily teach somebody about ribbon microphones if there are no ribbon microphones in the locker. So keep it practical. The other thing is teach the why. I think when people understand the why, they put more value into it. For example, we wrap cables over and under because it follows the natural coil of the cable and it prolongs their life. There's a reason why we do things. We use an SM58 on vocals because it's an industry standard. It's very durable, affordable, and it does sound great on vocals, contrary to what some people think. But that's a whole other stuff. Yeah, there are other vocal mics out there, but we don't need to get into that. Sorry, I already am opening up. Going down rabbit holes, I probably shouldn't. So let's talk about mixing. First up, an essential training tool is virtual sound check. If you have a digital console these days, just about every digital console I've come across in the field has the ability to do virtual sound check. What is virtual sound check? In terms of live sound anyways, and that's what I'm talking about here, it's the ability for us to record all the individual instruments in a multi-track recording software or digital audio workstation, and then we can record them just as they're coming into the console, and then play them back through the console, and it's just as if the band isn't there. Most people are familiar with this these days in live sound, unless you're kind of new to it, and then it's a new thing. But this is a really essential training tool, I think, especially going back to just the number of hours that it takes to master a craft. When it comes to musicians, for example, they can take their instrument home and practice. If you're doing live sound, the only time you really used to have to practice was when the band was there and on stage. And for those of us who learn that way, we know that it's not always the best environment for learning. Virtual sound check, on the other hand, gives us more time and opportunity to work with those musicians and what they're providing to us at the console without having to have them sit around and play things over and over again. So virtual sound check, it's a big thing. If you have the ability to do it and you're not recording your services, I highly, highly recommend you start getting in the habit of recording things. I think it's also a great way to evaluate yourself week to week by recording yourself. And right now, when I look at a lot of the comments in regard to streams and how people are shocked about how difficult it is, one of the first things that I kind of start thinking is, I think a lot of people have not been listening to their board mixes, because they might not be so surprised at their streams. But anyways, that is a whole other thing. So, stage one. Stage one is what I call mixable things. Great mixes start with great sources. The ultimate quality of a mix is really dependent on the sources that we have to work with. So the first goal, I think, in audio development is to understand what makes a good source. What does a good vocal sound like? What do good drums sound like? Good guitar, good bass. These aren't narrow things either. There's actually, they're wide windows, believe it or not. Sometimes people mistake taste for quality, but we just want to worry about what does good sound like. So an engineer should be able to listen to any source and evaluate it. Are the drums in tune? Is the tone at the amp in good shape? You need to develop your taste at this stage so that you can start getting a good idea of what does something good sound like. There's a George Martin quote I've always liked. George Martin, who was a legendary producer, produced the Beatles. He says, whether you have good taste or not depends on how many people agree with you. And I think this is an important thing to understand when it comes to taste. I know a lot of engineers who kind of have esoteric tastes in things that they enjoy, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay to like things that not a lot of people like, but if you're going to be engineering and you're going to be creating content for a large amount of people, you kind of want to understand what is it that people like, or what do they expect. You know, the thing about music is we are all so used to hearing it because it's pumping out of everywhere. I mean, you go to grocery shopping, you go to Target, there, you know, elevators, hallways, there's music everywhere. We're so used to hearing it all over the place. So people have expectations and ideas of what it's supposed to sound like. One of the things that's different, though, for engineers is a lot of times people who are new to engineering, they haven't really thought about it. They're not really thinking necessarily about what are the qualities of that instrument or that thing that I'm hearing that make it good. And those are the kinds of things you want to start identifying in this stage. The other side of it is, what are the things that we as engineers can do to help make a good source? I mean, some of it comes from the musicians and the players, a lot of it actually, but there are still things that we do as engineers that help us get good sources. So engineering skills that you can focus on in this stage. Mic choice. You know, and again, stick with the mics that you actually can choose from. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of microphone options these days. That's a whole Pandora's box to get into. So learn to choose the right mic out of the mics you have. Don't worry about what else is out there necessarily. Just start with what you've got. Mic placement. Mic placement is huge and a really big component of getting good sounds coming into our console and into our mixes. When I was an intern in a recording studio in the 90s, one of the big things I was taught, and one of the things I really, really appreciated from the engineer who mentored me, was he taught me about mic placement and how making small moves and little adjustments really can make a big impact on the sounds we're getting. So that's something to really sit around and work on. Input levels, setting input levels. It's really surprising to me a lot of times. I'll go into churches to mix, and I'll be mixing front of house, and there will be a monitor console, and that monitor console is controlling the gains, the head amps, the mic pre's for all the inputs. And it really baffles me sometimes at how little some of those operators understand about setting input levels. So learn how to do this here. That's a ground zero kind of concept in mixing and engineering, is getting your input levels set. Another thing in here is starting to understand the frequency spectrum by ear. You don't have to narrow this way down into knowing lots of individual frequencies. I would start with somebody, just what's bass and what's treble. Bass, treble, mid-range. These are basic concepts. Start splitting it up in there. But it's real important, I think, to learn the frequency spectrum and what do different frequencies in there kind of sound like. Because corrective EQ is another skill in here to start learning. If you mic it right, put the right mic on something and mic it right and push up the fader, what do you do when it's still not quite there? I mean, vocal mics are a perfect example of this. When I have a vocalist, I want them to get right on top of the mic in a live setting. Well, that's not necessarily where vocal mics sound the best, unfortunately, but sometimes I need them to be right on top of the microphone so that I can minimize all of the cymbal bleed, basically. That's the biggest issue these days. But I want to minimize the amount of cymbals that microphone is hearing relative to the voice that it's hearing. And the easiest way to do that is to have vocalists get right on top of the mics, even the background singers. Unfortunately, though, sometimes fortunately, but in most cases, that generates a lot of proximity effect. Not all microphones generate as much, as some of you probably know, but it's possible that having somebody that close might generate more proximity effect than we want. So corrective EQ to correct the excessive proximity effect and get it down to nice proximity effect. Finally, last one on here that I think is real important, and you could even start getting into this at ground zero with somebody, and that's personal interaction and etiquette. How do you interact with musicians? How do you interact with producers, creatives, anyone else who's going to be involved in the project, anyone else who's going to be involved in the service, senior pastors, pastors' wives, things like this? I mean, I'll just be honest with you. In my career, the thing that has gotten me in trouble the most has been when I failed at personal interaction and etiquette working with other people. That's the biggest thing. This is a really, really big deal. And it's not something I feel like I really started focusing on until I was deeper in my career than I really should have. So start on it here. It will help you later. One other thing I have in my notes, going back to understanding the frequency spectrum by ear, there is software out there that can help with this. There's things like Quiz Tones is an app that I think you can still get on your smartphone. That's a good one to kind of start doing it. I think there's a website, Sound Gym. There's some other things out there. You could probably Google frequency training, and it would give you some suggestions. So that's stage one. Lots of stuff, stage one, which kind of unfortunate because it's easy to do this, but a lot of this is kind of a fire hose in a way. So stage one. Stage two, to me, is instrument balance. And the primary goal in mixing really is balance. I mean, mixing is all about creating and maintaining a musical balance and focus. We want to make a song work. We want to make the performance work. So can you set and maintain relative levels between the various inputs on the console so that it sounds like music? When I'm training in churches, when I'm listening to live streams, this is a big thing that I notice is all about balance. The balance is off in a lot of places. In particular, one of the things I notice a lot right now, especially with vocals, is sometimes the vocals are too loud, sometimes the vocals are too soft. That's an instrument balance issue. The other thing a lot of engineers miss in this kind of stage or this phase and working on this is it's not a set and forget kind of thing. Mixing it's an active thing. We need to maintain the balance. We need to make sure that the things that are important are heard when they're supposed to be heard. A lot of times I'm seeing in churches right now or the last few years is we'll have multiple worship leaders on a song. So I might have one lead vocal 1 minute, and then the next minute that person is singing background vocals and somebody else is singing leads. Well, I need to maintain that relationship. That's an instrument balance thing. Another thing in churches especially, or any kind of live events you're doing, is transitions. How are you navigating from one element to the next? How do you go from live music to speech, to videos, to playback? I mean, this is an area where I've seen a lot of guys who are concert engineers and who are great music engineers for concerts, and transitions will bite them because in a concert they go from one song to the next song to the next song. Maybe they'll talk in between, but it's the same person and it's not as strung together. Most church services, at least the modern worship services that I'm involved in these days, most of them, they really want them to flow naturally from one element to the next. So that's something that faders are your friends. So instrument balance, engineer skills. What can you focus on in here? Console management, laying out the console in a manner that makes sense, using groups, VCAs, maybe some basic automation even. That might be a little sketchy. I don't know why I put that in here, but that's something that you can start doing in this section. The other thing, driving is what I refer to it. How do you drive the mix? Do you push volumes in places? Are you pulling things back? I was watching a video of Andy Wallace mixing. Andy Wallace is a renowned mix engineer, mixed a lot of records. The one that a lot of people probably know is Nirvana's Nevermind, Smells Like Teen Spirit. That was Andy Wallace. He's done a ton of other stuff too, though. I was watching a video of him mixing and watching how he, automates or drives the mix and sets levels in different sections and adjusts them over time. That's an important thing to start figuring out and understanding. Another thing in here is critical listening skills. And critical listening skills are always a big deal, but especially now, you got to get a good handle on really learning to listen critically. So awareness. Just being aware of what's going on stage, what's going on in the song, what instruments are playing, what are the different parts, things like that, having an understanding of the arrangement. That's all stuff in here that you kind of want to get a good handle on. To me, this stage is kind of the make or break stage for whether or not someone has potential to go anywhere as a mixer. If you can't get a balance, a basic musical instrument balance, and it doesn't have to be perfect, but just something that's good that sounds like music. If you can't get that, you're gonna struggle with everything because this is kind of square one in a way. And in a lot of ways, I even think that sort of stage one with mixable things and stage two, this instrument balance, they're kind of swappable. They're sort of two sides of a coin. Most of the stuff I'm doing with churches when I'm going in and training, usually it relates to these two stages and helping guys with that. And I have strategies that I teach on both to help improve them. So, and one other thing I should mention is one of these stages in particular might resonate more for you depending on the situation you're in. For example, when I was working in recording studios and we were doing a lot of tracking, it was really important for us to get good sources and good things recorded. So that would be more of a stage one mixable things. Some churches, though, maybe the focus, or maybe what's really more important right now for where you're at, is having a good instrument balance and having that balance feel good. Maybe, so you might have to juggle that. But for me, if I'm starting from scratch with someone, I think get the sounds good to begin with, because that's a really big part of the battle. And if you've got good stuff to begin with, it just makes everything else a whole lot easier. So, mixable things. Next stage, fit and overall tonality. So, balancing the range of human hearing. And what I'm thinking about here in terms of fit is, can I hear everything? In live sound especially, I kind of want people to be able to look at the stage and hear everything, or at least feel like they could hear everything if they wanted to hear everything. So a lot of that, some of it's arrangement, and sometimes that might be a discussion you might need to have with music personnel on stage. If everybody's playing the exact same note, the loudest one's going to win. The other ones might add to it and help create a texture, but really the loudest one is going to win most of the time. So going back to etiquette, personal interaction, that's why you master that at the beginning, so that now you can go and have that conversation, and people are happy when you have that conversation. Arrangement's a big part of that, as I said. There are things that we can do as engineers, because some of this is also getting into masking. Masking is basically when the frequency content of one instrument is covering over another. So maybe we've got all of these good sounds coming into our console. We've got a really good sounding vocal, but now when we turn up the guitars, well, now that vocal doesn't sound so good anymore. That's a fit issue for me. It's a masking issue. That's one of the things that in this stage I would focus on learning how to deal with that. That's a big thing I teach people when I'm out doing training, is how do you manage this kind of overall fit? The other side of it is, what is the overall tonality of the mix? Is it too bright? Is it too dark? Is it muddy? Is there clarity? Is there too much clarity? Does it hurt? Big thing in live sound is that pain side of things. Most loudness complaints in churches, even probably big concerts, they're not actually about loudness. I mean, sometimes they are if we're talking about concerts, but in churches, a lot of times they're not necessarily about loudness. It's about frequency balance. As volume increases, our hearing perception changes, and we get more sensitive to harsh sounds. Guitars and vocals tend to get brighter and harsher as we turn them up. Too much bass or low frequency can make things dull and muddy. So this is where we want to focus on, how do we get our overall mix to sound good? We're balancing relative levels as well as balancing the entire frequency spectrum. And some of you guys probably know that some of that kind of goes together, because different instruments a lot of times land in different parts of the spectrum. So skills you can focus on in here: mastering the frequency spectrum by ear. This is the place to really kind of drill in, I think, on EQ and frequencies. Personally, I'm not a stickler for knowing exact frequencies, but you should kind of know what range things are in. I mean, every kind of octave sort of has a tonal quality to it, and that should be something that you should be able to identify so that you can kind of get in the ballpark to begin with. Knowing frequencies by ear, to me, it's sort of like perfect pitch. And past a certain age, you're probably just not going to be able to develop it. You can develop relative pitch, though, so that you can tell, do you need to, where is something relative to something else? Is it higher or lower? That kind of thing, which is handy, because if you boost or cut the wrong frequency on an EQ, you should be able to tell, oh, I cut too low or I cut too high. That's the kind of stuff in this stage I would focus on. So, You can see we're starting to drill down. The first 2 stages, lots of stuff. Now we're getting into smaller ones. Stage 4 to me is sitting together. Bands that play together stay together. Sitting together for me is all about dynamics. If we want a group to sound like they are playing together, like they are all one band, they really need similar dynamics. They need to get louder together. They need to get softer together. They also need consistency within their own performance. Big instrument, a big important thing in mixes is the vocals. And vocals have a tendency to be really dynamic. And when we take an electric guitar that is distorted, those tend to not be dynamic. So if we try and put this very dynamic vocal with a guitar that's not dynamic, they don't sit together. So how do we get that vocal to sit with the guitar? So compression is a big tool we have here. Fader rides are another thing. I do a lot of manual fader rides to manage dynamics, but compression is something in here that I would focus on starting to learn some of the basics. Compression to me is one of the hardest things to master for engineers. I mean, I've been involved in audio for years, and I feel like every year is the first I finally figured out compression, and next year I'll feel the same way. There's always more. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting out of it, and I have a really good handle on compression, I think. But it's a hard thing to master because it really is supposed to be a subtle thing. You know, when people listen to a vocal on the radio, they don't go, "Oh wow, I love the compression on that," because they're not supposed to notice it. So how do you learn to use something that's supposed to be invisible in the first place? That's not easy. Audio in general is kind of a black art because we can't really see things. We're just hearing it. So compression, to me, compression, another thing, it's good for a few different things. The 2 main uses, I think, though, is number 1, leveling things out. Some engineers would debate with me on that, but it is good for leveling things out, I think. And the other thing is sound design and shaping. And in this stage, I would really focus more on leveling things out and getting dynamics controlled. So, skills to focus on here. Understanding compression basics. For me, that would be probably 2 controls on a compressor, the threshold and the ratio. I wouldn't worry too much about attack and release at this point. It's never too early to start getting into that, but the main things I would focus on here is those controls. The other thing is learning to identify volume movement. And this is a big thing. I don't even know how to explain this. If you can't hear an issue to begin with, how are you going to know how to address it? And learning how to identify when is there a dynamics issue, that takes time to develop. I think I actually have a video on my channel about that and about hearing dynamics and things you can listen for. But that's something in here I would focus on. Now, some people might think, oh, you should focus on this earlier. But to me, this is something later on. You know, one of the things about audio development that I think is so much harder right now is, at least harder than when I got started, is we have so many more tools available to us. When I started in audio, the consoles I was on, we didn't have compressors. All we had basically was volume and EQ, and you had to learn to make that work. And I had a lot of really good mixes just without any compression. Now, I don't want to mix today without compression. It would probably drive me bonkers. But starting out, just learning to get a balance and learning how to manage that, that's really important, I think. As we're going deeper into these stages, these are things that we're getting closer to kind of the icing on the cake. So, stage 5, space. When I'm talking about space, I'm thinking about spatial effects. So reverbs, delays. These can seem kind of simple on the surface, but there's actually a lot of different types of reverbs. There's different types of delays, tape or digital with reverbs. There's plates, halls, chambers. These days they're all fake because we're using plugins, but those all come from analog kind of real things, and they all have different qualities and different sounds, and there's different times you might want to pick one over the other. This is the stage to kind of start thinking about that. With delays, there's different ways you can use delays. We can do rhythmic delays. We can do slaps, like tape slaps. We can use the Haas effect for delays. That does something different. That's kind of in here with space. One of the big things I notice right now in a lot of streaming mixes is there's not a lot of space in them, and things kind of they seem kind of flat and sort of one-dimensional, maybe two-dimensional. Space can help us get more depth in mixes and have things more three-dimensional. In live sound, it's probably not, at least I don't think it's as big of an issue, because we're usually doing a performance in a live space, and that space is already giving us kind of some natural space. That doesn't mean you don't need to, or you won't benefit from doing some spatial effects and processing, but I don't think it matters quite to the same degree as it does when we get into something streaming online, or we're doing recording kind of work in that kind of thing. Having things in some kind of space and some kind of cohesive space to make things feel like they're all together and playing together in the same space, I think that's an important thing. Skill to focus on understanding and using reverb, and understanding and using delays. So take the ones you've got, play around with them, try different things. That's what I would work on in this stage. So stage 6, details and enhancement. As my late friend Andrew Stone always loved to say, details are what take us from good to great. And as we're getting into this stage of development, that's what I would start focusing on. This is all the stuff that a lot of new engineers mistake as being the key, and it's actually not. The keys are that instrument balance, having good tones and good sources. This is just the icing on the cake. This is also where undisciplined engineers can really start to get carried away. So another thing, this is where the mixing tricks kind of start coming into play. Things I would think about in this stage is like using compression to add or reduce punch, processing things to make them sound bigger, processing things in ways to make them sound wider. The width thing, not necessarily as big of an issue of importance in a live sound scenario, but in a streaming or a broadcast scenario, in a recording scenario, having that width is a important thing these days. This can also get into some of the more complicated mixing techniques, things like using sidechain compression, multiband compression, adding distortion, using exciters, things like that. This is where I would start getting into that. So just remember, mastered all that other stuff first. And that doesn't mean, again, just to reiterate on this whole roadmap I'm kind of laying out, that doesn't mean you wouldn't use any of these kind of techniques earlier on in your development. What I mean is I wouldn't get hung up on them. I wouldn't focus on them too much. I wouldn't worry too much about how do I parallel compress everything on the console when I don't have a good understanding of compression to begin with. Get that stuff mastered, and then you can really start focusing in on this. Parallel compression, for example, is something that can be used in a variety of different ways to do a variety of different things to a sound. I have in my mixing template in my studio here, I actually have 2 different parallel compression buses that I use for the drums, and each one of them does a little different thing. And I decide, which one of those do I want to use more of? Do I want to use them both? Sometimes I don't use them at all. So that's the kind of stuff in this stage you can start thinking about and start figuring out. But prior to this, I wouldn't get hung up on it. I feel like a lot of guys just early on, they go, ooh, I've got to use this, or there's a fancy exciter plugin out there, and you start putting it on everything. It's like, well, sometimes people are adding things like exciters. An example of this might be something like the Waves Vitamin plugin, which is a great plugin. Sometimes the things that people are doing with that, they could have achieved the same results with an EQ, and that EQ would have probably sounded more natural than adding an exciter, because exciters can do really cool things, but when used too much, they can make things brittle and unnatural too. So this is the stage where I would say, hey, now is the time to get into the fun things. And for engineers like me at kind of my stage, this is the stuff we like to talk about. And I kind of feel responsible for putting too much emphasis on this stuff sometimes, because when I'm writing articles for my own blog, this is the stuff that's a lot more fun to write about. It's a lot more fun to show and to demonstrate. But it's really not the heart or crux of what makes a mix happen. I mean, to me, it's instrument balance and having good sources. So another thing I want to mention about this stage, right around here, stage 5 and stage 6 is usually where mixes can start sounding competitive. And what I mean by having a competitive mix is having a mix that can kind of stand up with other professional mixes. Sometimes you might have them. Sometimes this is just the stage where people start thinking about it. Do I want to have a competitive mix? Early on in development, a lot of guys, they just want to have a good mix. Start getting this deep in your career, you want to have a mix that's as good as so-and-so. You might even start thinking about, I want to have a mix that's better than so-and-so, although I wouldn't worry about that too much at this point. And I wouldn't worry about this too much before you get to this point. It's not necessarily that important. When you're starting out, take the time early in your development, take advantage of that to fail. I think right now there are some scenarios where there's not as much margin anymore to do that. But, looking back early in my career, I wasn't mixing in really big rooms. And for the really big churches like I get to work with these days, I was in smaller ones. And that's almost a better place to learn, I think, because there's a lot more grace and there's a lot more room for you to learn and to experiment and to fail. You have to fail at doing these things before you're going to get good. That's how you figure out what works and what doesn't. So competitive mixes is kind of right around here. But anyways, skills you can focus on at this stage, like I said, advanced compression uses, shaping things, side chaining things, multiband processing, dynamic EQ might be something in here you can worry about. Parallel processing, it's parallel compression gets all the love, but it's not the only type of parallel processing out there. Another thing in here, manipulating physics. So using the Haas effect, phase, things like that. Adding harmonics to things, exciters, saturation, etc. Mix tricks. That's what this stage is. So I got one more stage. Stage 7, emotion and impact. This is my last stage. So if you've got questions, this would be a good time to start throwing them up in the chat. Stage 7, emotion and impact. When we're mixing music, this is what it's all about. We're communicating emotion. We're trying to communicate this thing that can't be communicated in words. So what do we want people to feel from what they're hearing? In the earlier stages, a lot of times we're just worried about having it good or having it great. In this stage, this is where I would start thinking more about, well, what is it really supposed to, what do we want people to do? How do we want them to react? At this stage, I would focus on, what can you do at the console to kind of express and emphasize the emotional content of the music. So, and this is the harder stuff to kind of wrap your head around and really start thinking about. But this is the stuff that I kind of am thinking about more often in these days. And it can get kind of deep. Skills to focus on. How does everything you've learned prior to this affect emotion? And what emotions are right for the material you're working on? Earlier on, a lot of times we might be thinking about, how do I get that snare sound, or how do I get that vocal sound? And even earlier on, we might just be thinking, how do I get a vocal sound? At this stage, it's more about how do I get the right sound for this particular song or band or performance. So that's emotion and impact. Hard to talk about. So, but this is where you would really start thinking about that. This is what I think about a lot. For example, I did a recording and a mix for church in town maybe a month ago or so, and the day before the recording, I got to work with one of my favorite drummers in town by the name of Scott Meter, and we went in a day earlier and set up the drums to get drum sounds set up, because it's always nice to get those set up ahead of time before the rest of the band gets there, because it tends to take the longest. I don't know if any of you guys have noticed that, but getting drum sounds typically takes a little longer because there's more microphones usually involved. So he came in early and he brought in a couple of different snares. Both of those snare drums sounded really good, but I did. We leaned towards, one of those in particular for the project that we were doing, because we felt like this is the snare that's going to be more right for this particular content. That doesn't mean that other snare was bad. That other snare would have been great for some other things, and we could have used it and it would have worked, but I just felt, and we both kind of agreed, it's like, no, that other one is the one. So that's kind of, at this point, that's where I would start thinking about that more often. So, again, there are all of the stages: mixable things, instrument balance, fit, overall tonality, sitting together, space, detail and enhancement, emotion and impact. I keep meaning to type all this stuff up. I'm going to type all these up, and I'm going to put them in a little PDF. And if you subscribe to my website, which is goingto11.com, and I'll put that up in a minute, I will email you a copy of this, or I'll email you a link to get that. That'll be one of the things I'll send you for that. Real quick, other things, my blog, goingto11.com, I write lots of articles and put them up there. So please check those out. And a lot of that is about my own development. Sometimes now they venture a little more into tutorial-oriented stuff, but there's a lot of stuff on there of my development, and I've been putting stuff up there for, might be 15 years now. So you can go back to the archives to when I really didn't know I kind of knew what I was doing, but I figured a lot of stuff out over time, as everybody does. When I hang out with guys who are 10, 15, 20 years ahead of me in their career, they're still learning. This isn't something that you stop doing over time. Learning is ongoing. So let me go back. I'll pull that up, and here, I'll leave that up for you. So I'm going to look at some of these questions and see if I can answer some of them. All right, first question. And I know, guys, some of your names are real easy to pronounce, but I'm not even going to do it because I'm not going to butcher anybody's name. So first question, how do you assess someone's potential to be a mix engineer? That's a great question. I think, something I would talk to somebody about is, do you even listen to music? What are you into? What do you hear in certain things? Sometimes I run into audio engineers, and you say, what music do you listen to? And they go, oh, well, I listen to NPR, or I just listen to podcasts. It's like, well, it's going to make it kind of hard to develop tastes if you're not listening to music. So that's something I want to check and make sure somebody is actually listening to music. Are they into music? Are they musical? I mean, there are some people who get into production who are more technically oriented, and there is definitely a place for that. I mean, we need people who know how to put things together and set stuff up. That doesn't necessarily mean they kind of have this craft or creative side to them. I don't think someone needs to be a musician to be an engineer. And I know that's something that people give a lot of credibility to and a lot of emphasis to. I mean, you can see I've got one of my guitars is back there in my studio behind me. I think it definitely helps, but I don't think it's important. And, I've got two examples on that. My good friend Chris Briley, who I worked with for many years at North Point, who taught me a lot of stuff about mixing. I stole lots of tricks from Chris because he was just an awesome engineer, still is an awesome engineer. He's not a musician. Does come from kind of a musical family. I believe that he's got a sibling who plays music. Tom Lord-Alge, big name, mix engineer. He's mixed everything from Hanson to Marilyn Manson. You can look him up if you're not familiar with Tom Lord-Alge. Tom Lord-Alge is not a musician. And Tom Lord-Alge has mixed way more hits than me and probably a lot of engineers out there today. So it definitely helps, I think, having somebody who is a musician, but it's not necessarily a prerequisite to me. Other things I might want to check is, just playing something back for someone. Can they tell what's louder and what's softer? Do they even have an ear for kind of balance? For us, when I was on staff at North Point, when we would have new guys join the team, I always started them out as, at the time when they first started, we were calling them M2s, and I changed it to calling it A2 because in the audio industry, there aren't really M2s, but there are A2s, and basically they were just assistants. So they would learn all of that stuff that I talked about in Ground Zero. What's the gear we use? Where is it kept? What are the processes and procedures? There'd be things like, how do you check in-ears out? Because at the time we were supplying in-ears for musicians. How do you check those out to musicians? We used to take their car keys from them because nobody's going to drive off without their car keys. That way we would always get their in-ears back because we had a lot of them walk. We learned that the hard way. Not on purpose, people, they don't think about it. It's not, there's nothing malicious about it, but guys they would leave with their in-ears, and then they would forget to bring them back on Sunday after rehearsal in the middle of the week, and then you'd have to supply them with a new pair that they would subsequently walk off with. So we started taking their keys. But anyways, things like that they would start learning, and it would also give us an opportunity to start talking to them about things and to get a sense for, do they have kind of an ear for music to start getting involved in that? Not every church has the ability to kind of do that. So I would just start, what music do you listen to? Do they listen to music at all? Do they have kind of a sense of music? Can they, if you play a beat, can they move to it? Do they have a sense of rhythm? These kinds of things, I would be looking at that. Another thing I want to look at is, do they have attention to details? Because sooner or later, you're going to have to get into details in audio. And some guys just don't, they're very big picture. And I think one of the challenges in audio is you have to kind of both be able to zoom out to a big picture look at things. You want to hear the overall song. Robert Scoville had a great quote that I always liked, which was, mix like a pro, listen like a fan, something along those lines. You have to be able to kind of zoom out and hear the whole thing while also going in and zooming into the details. But you can't have somebody who's just totally caught up in the details. Sometimes I would walk in on somebody and like the hi-hat is ripping everybody's head off. Meanwhile, the vocal is buried somewhere and they're going after some minute detail, trying to like fine tune the threshold on a gate or something like that. Meanwhile, there's all this other stuff that's not working and that really needs to be addressed first and foremost. Which is why I teach a concept called priority mixing when I go out and do a lot of kind of seminars and workshops and things like that. So anyways, I hope that answers. I would just check, do they have an ear for it? Just kind of getting to know people. I mean, getting to know people in general is not a bad idea. Go get coffee with them, or I used to take volunteers out to lunch. So do that and just kind of get a sense. And you can also get a sense for, are they going to fit on your team? Because sometimes, you might have somebody who is great at what they do, but if they're not a fit for your culture and they can't adapt to your culture, that's going to be problematic. Maybe I'll do, I had another talk that I did. Maybe I'll do it as another webinar on finding volunteers, because I know that's a big challenge for a lot of people. And right now in this COVID-19 thing we're in, I think it's a totally different thing, because the skill set for mixing for online, to me, and maybe I've just been doing it too long. I mean, mixing is mixing, but things are exposed a lot more in kind of a controlled studio environment. And that can kind of overwhelm some people, is what I've discovered. So right now, finding people, I think it's a lot harder. And again, it's one of those things. Everybody, if you're in an organization where the bar needs to be here right from the start, maybe finding a volunteer isn't necessarily the way to go right away. But that's a whole other discussion, and that kind of gets into that other talk. So, anyways, let me go down to the next question. Is it possible to teach musicality, or is it an inherent thing? That is a great question. I don't know. I think some of it's inherent. I think sometimes that gets more weight than is the truth. I mean, there are some people out there who are probably clinical. They're just tone deaf and they don't hear it. But I don't think that there's as many of those people out there as a lot of us kind of think there is. So it might be possible. I mean, I would just start trying to teach people, an easy thing to do. And this is, again, why, with these stages that I have listed, I don't necessarily, it's not like you just, you figure all of this one stage out and then you move on to the next. These are just the areas to focus on. Something you can do with somebody real early on is, if you get good sounds and good sources into the console, hand them the faders and see what they do. Can they just push them up and balance things? Can they tell when something is too loud or isn't too loud? And what happens when you coach them on how you want things to be? Because that's, when we're getting into teachability, a lot of that, I think, is, it's a coaching kind of issue. Are people going to be open to feedback, and can they make adjustments that will get the results that you're looking for, or that your leadership is looking for, or that your client is looking for? So, anyways, I think it probably is teachable to a certain extent. There's probably like a baseline to it, but if somebody can kind of hum a tune, or tap their feet, they've got a little bit of musicality in them. It's not, we don't need yo-yo ma's necessarily. I mean, it doesn't hurt. One of the things I've talked about, a lot of churches, they get hung up on, we want volunteers, or we want we want volunteers, or we want staff, or we want contract guys. And to me, I think the real question you answer first is, what are we looking for to be in that seat? Just in terms of skill set, what do they need to do? And in different churches, this is a very different thing. Some churches, they need a higher level mix engineer, someone who's going to do the kinds of things that I do. Other churches, though, that's not their primary need. They need somebody who is going to do really good at developing the community, and who's going to do really good at making people feel like they're a part of something, making sure that the ship stays afloat and keeps running. Doesn't necessarily have to be executed at this really high top level all the time. So there's different needs on that. So I would kind of look at, what do you need it to be? And then decide, is that something we can teach or not? So I'm weaving off the track, which is why we have a list. I hope that answers the question. So let's see. Subscribe. Thank you for subscribing. All right. Last question. If anybody else has other questions, how many people are still watching? Okay, there's a few. If you have any other questions, feel free to put them in. Otherwise, I guess this will be the last question. What's your opinion on systematic academic training versus mentorship? I think there's a place for systematic and kind of academic training. I mean, a lot of what I do is kind of systematic and academic. When churches are bringing me in to do like one-off workshops and things like that, it's part of what I do. So yeah, I'm in favor of it. I think there's benefit to it. I think there's benefit to going to conferences for sure. I mean, I've gotten things out of going to conferences and hearing people speak. But I think mentorship is something that is also really important and is another big piece of the puzzle. It's something I'm trying to do with more and more clients, and to have kind of an ongoing thing, because I had a client, someone said this to me. They said, training is not an inoculation. You can't just get training one time and suddenly everything's better. To me, it's kind of it's a stepping stone. It might give you some information, help fill in some gaps so that now you can move forward on the craft. But I think having a mentor, having people there to coach you, to me, that's where people go further faster, which is part of why I haven't done a lot of online training in the past and doing video courses, because my focus is on going out and sitting next to somebody where we can have a dialogue and actually have an interaction. A lot of times, I'm going into churches and we're using the tracks of their band. So it has the context of the situation that they're used to right there. And that's something I'm moving towards doing over online right now, because I think there are some things that I can teach one-on-one online, but I think there's also a lot of benefit to just having somebody there in person. So mentorship, really important. The biggest jumps I probably had in my development was when I had somebody there next to me, telling me what to work on, telling me what wasn't working. And there's different ways, different people respond to hearing that in different ways. And I've heard it in all the ways, I think. But I think having somebody there, it really does matter. And, the thing with teams, especially, when I was on staff at North Point, I had about 24 audio volunteers that were just audio. Not all of those guys were mixing front of house. Some of them were mixing monitors. We had guys who were A2s, but it was about 24. The church I was on staff at before that, when I left, we had 12 audio volunteers that were strictly in audio. So the mentorship there was really important. It was a big part of development, because everybody's at a different place. So when I would do kind of the systematic, more academic stuff when I was on staff, it was more focused on what are some of the big picture things, what are areas that as a team we're not doing as good at. I remember there was a season where my associate director had just he was too good. He was too good at setting up the stage and pinning the stage and getting everything ready for rehearsal. And as a result, our team got really bad at troubleshooting things because they just weren't used to having to fix things over time. So we did a training session on troubleshooting. So what are the big picture? I think that's where academic kind of stuff tends to work better. What are the bigger ideas? That's why a lot of times when I'm out training, I'm teaching this kind of bigger concept of priority mixing. And then after that, we will drill into more specifics of, like EQing and getting a good balance and strategies for doing that kind of stuff. So anyways, I hope that answers your question. Let's see. When is the Mike Snobbery webinar coming? It's not coming from me because I'm not much of a mic snob. There are microphones that I probably gravitate towards using, but for me, a lot of the front of house situations I'm in these days, since I'm an independent engineer, when I go into churches, they've got their microphones that they use, and 98% of the time, I just use what they've got. Sometimes they might have something out that I don't necessarily want to use, and I might dig something different out of their mic locker to do that, because one of the things I've noticed, and we did this too when I was on staff, but there are microphone fads that I think happen over time, where there are certain microphones that become kind of the in vogue microphone because they were used on an award show or some big artist toured with it, and now it's like that's the microphone and everybody's buying it, and I've fallen victim to that in the past. I don't get too hung up on that stuff anymore. I kind of know what works. People don't hire me to come in and mix with a certain gear. They hire me because they want a certain result. And I think that's something that a lot of guys can kind of lose sight of. And I teach this in seminars that I do. Nobody cares how you get there. They just care about the result. Only the audio snobs like me, sorry, are going to come up to you afterwards and look at what you did. They're going to go, well, the mix sounded great, but you were doing 10 dB of gain reduction on that vocal in places, and that's not good. It doesn't. Nobody really thinks like that except for audio engineers. Everybody else who's listening, they're listening to what does it sound like. So I don't worry about the microphone stuff. I think some engineers have a lot more stock in it. I think one of the things I learned really early on in my career with microphone placement and microphone choice, and especially with microphone placement, was how to make just about any microphone work on something. It gets a little dicier in a live scenario, and the first thing I'm thinking off the top of my head is a cello, because getting cellos to work live, I don't know, it's really difficult for me, because since they're putting out such low frequency, it has a tendency to feedback, and they're not, an acoustic cello on a stage full of electrified instruments, electric guitars, and loud drums. That's one of the bigger challenges to me, to put a mic on and to actually have it work when the band is going full throttle. So there are some mics sometimes that work. But if a cello is just playing on its own solo, I could probably get just about any mic to work to where I could get it usable. So I don't get too I don't get too snobby in microphones. I mean, at this point, I kind of know what I make work and what I like to use, because it just makes things easier for me at the console based on the way I do stuff. But that doesn't mean that they're the right microphones. They're the right ones for me. I think microphones in a lot of ways, they're kind of like guitars. You know, I got a Tele over here. My Taylor is back here. I got another acoustic in a case. You know, it's personal taste. Some guys like Teles, some guys like Strats, some guys like Les Pauls. I think microphones, it's kind of the same thing. I think consoles, PAs, a lot of that stuff, there are things, you know, we get hung up on what is the best, and it's really what is the best for me, in my opinion, but it's just a taste thing. So probably not going to have a mic snobbery thing for me, unless if I have a really bad gig one day where I'm working with something I really don't like, I might rant. But even then, I probably wouldn't, because that stuff doesn't bother me as much as probably it bothers other guys. So, how do you bring that passion out from volunteers for this side of music? That's a really good question. And then I'm gonna do one more after. I think this will be the last one, and I'll answer your Steve. I'll answer your question. Are you saving this on YouTube? I think I'm gonna save it on YouTube. If I go back and really don't like it, I'm not gonna save it. If I don't save this, I'll just film it and put it in post and put it up eventually. But I'm probably gonna save it. So, question: how do you bring that passion out from volunteers for this side of music? That's a good question. I think that is really, it's a leadership thing. And a good way to do it is to demonstrate it yourself. When I first went on staff, one of the things that my boss, or when I first went on staff at North Point, one of the big things that my boss kind of put in me was, I need to be the best one on the team. I need to kind of set the bar for things. I need to go ahead of everybody and show them, like, this is how much focus and attention and detail and importance that I just put on it just for me, not even necessarily in terms of expectations, although expectations, I think, are a really important thing to give people when they are joining a team, which is a whole other topic of discussion. But, you know, to get people who are passionate about stuff, I think I want to demonstrate that. That was another reason why when we would bring guys on to the team at North Point, we would start them as A2s, because a lot of guys, you know, they get into production, and especially in a facility like North Point, where you've got this big kind of picture that everybody is seeing. You know, it's a big visual, big PA. We've got, you know, the fancy digital consoles, which at the time not everybody had. You know, it was a touring environment, basically, in terms of the equipment that we were using, and also probably in terms of the results that were being expected that we were going to deliver. There was a high bar there at the time when I was on staff. So a lot of people would come in and they want to get right behind a console, but we would start them as A2s, because then they would see what is involved. What are all the other little details that are involved? What are the things that people are going to be criticizing you about and giving you feedback? And how detailed are they going to get on what they're expecting from you? And it would also show them, you know, how much do we just care about doing a thing? I mean, man, my volunteers at North Point they were awesome. And I think, you know, having guys come in and seeing that was how we would get people fired up and passionate about that. And we would go hang out after rehearsals a lot of times. And it would help kind of weed people out, I think, just naturally, because they would see the focus and they would see the intention that we all had, you know, that I demonstrated, and that my guys also, they were on board with that too. So Yeah. So anyway, sorry, I miss those guys, but I hope that answers. I hope that answers the question. So, anyways, guys, thank you so much for tuning in and watching. This went longer than I was hoping and expecting, but thank you for everyone who stuck around. If you haven't been to my website, going to11.com, there's articles up there if you want to get some training, whether it's, for your team or coaching individually. I do this stuff online, and I can do it remotely, and I'm working on getting it set up so that we can dig in on a mix. I'm gonna try and do kind of a mixed deconstruction and Q&A sometime soon, and that's going to be private for people who subscribe to my website. So head over to going to11.com and subscribe to the updates, and I'll let you know when I'm going to be doing that. And again, if you want to get some help personally, please drop me a line, contact, and we'll figure it out. So thanks for tuning in. I will talk to you soon.